Well, we want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. We really appreciate you being here. I'm Robert Stiles. I'm the Program Director for the Kansas Telehealth Rocks program, as well as the Kansas Disaster Outreach program. And I want to introduce Evelyn Nelson, who is over this program and all of the other work that we do with school districts and around the state of Kansas with behavioral health. So Evelyn, I'll let you start us off today.
Super. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad to see returning faces and new faces on our Echo, and excited to talk with you today about disaster interventions for youth and families. I know sometimes, starting the week, it's kind of a heavy topic to touch base, but I think what you'll hear today is that there are many ways we can support youth and families, and really putting our heads together to think about different ways that we can support during the public health emergency, and then support around disasters more broadly and traumas. So I want to just touch base about a couple of house cleaning things before we get rolling with our excellent presentations. First off, just to let you all know, this series is part of our Kansas Disaster Outreach, a SAMHSA supported project, so we're appreciative of that support. We'll just start off with some reminders. We'd love it if you enter your name and where you're from in the chat. That helps us really get to know all of us and have that community of learning. And then it also helps make sure that we can share your certificates of attendance and get to those to you after the event. This session is being recorded, and we'll be able to then share it with you afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, so we'd love for you to share in questions and comments in the chat, and then also, feel free to unmute yourself as you have questions and comments come to mind. We appreciate if you're able to keep your cameras on. It just kind of helps give that feel where we get to know you and you get to know us. It's great if you can go ahead and change your names by looking at the 3 dots on your Zoom screen and then typing in your name. That also helps us all get to know one another. So let me just start off introducing the speakers that we'll have today. We're fortunate to have with us Joa Williams, Aaron Hambrick, and Melissa Maris. And they're 3 wonderful youth-focused both researchers and psychologists. Each is an assistant professor. So Dr. Maris joins us from University of Missouri, where she is an assistant professor and then also has real expertise and passion for rural school-based services. Joa Williams is a psychologist and assistant professor at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and he brings a particular expertise and skills for psychological recovery. And then Aaron Hambrick joins us also from University of Missouri, Kansas City, where she's an assistant professor and leader in psychological first aid. I think we're ready to get rolling. Again, please do type in your questions and comments throughout the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evelyn. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Maris, and as Evelyn, I'm coming to you from Columbia, Missouri. So I hope that you are having a good Tuesday wherever you are joining us from. Just a couple more quick housekeeping things, some project disclosures in terms of our relationships. And then Christy, if we can go to the next slide, just wanted to let you all know that we are sharing recommendations today that come from the best of what we know, from what works. And so we are going to be relying on our evidence base here. And the last one is that after this webinar, we are going to send a follow-up survey, and we really appreciate your feedback on that. In addition to some feedback about today's presentation, we also wanted to get some input from you about what future sessions might look like. Today, we're going to be providing an overview of kind of disaster response and early intervention, and are going to talk a little bit more about some specific kinds of sets of practices that you can use that we hope to be able to continue to learn with you about in the coming days. So please complete that survey when it comes into your inbox. And speaking of surveys, we wanted to share a little bit about who is joining us today. So based on your all's registration responses, this is what you all said. So we asked on the registration for input on your all's prior experience working with children and families in the early aftermath of disaster exposure. So you can see here in the blue are our strongly agree and agree. So about 60% of you all are agreeing that you've had prior experience working with children and families in the early aftermath of disaster exposure. Only about 15% who disagreed. We are excited you are with us as well, but a fair number, so about 25% who neither agree or disagree. And we're absolutely curious about your input on this, but kind of our hypothesis is that we are in a kind of a strange place when it comes to trauma and disaster and even talking about these kinds of responses. Of course, we have all and are all struggling through the COVID pandemic. And certainly that is a disaster. That's a major event that has affected us all. But language really matters when we talk about trauma and what that means. And so we're going to start off by talking about that specifically and what we mean by that. But in terms of sort of our first activity that we'd like to do today, we're hoping that you could help us with kind of thinking through sort of what might be growth or positive change that would result from a disaster. So we know that there are, of course, a number of negative outcomes associated with disasters. We're hoping to talk today about early interventions that can mitigate some of those negative outcomes. But we also know that there are positives that can come out of these kind of uncontrolled, unwanted events. So this area of post-traumatic growth is getting a lot of attention and research now. And so Christy's actually going to share a link that we can actually do kind of an engaging word cloud here. So all you're going to do is click the link in the chat and then put in a word or a couple words that describe the type of unexpected growth or positive change that might result from a disaster. Of course, we don't want disasters to happen, but again, we know that there are positives that can emerge from that. And we're seeing a real shift now in the way that COVID is being addressed in terms of some of the positive things that came out. So let's take just a moment and watch as you all share your input here. We'll see kind of what emerges. Any words that are repeated are going to get larger. So we'll get to see that happen as well. Fantastic. Thank you all so much for putting in your words, and feel free to continue to add them in there. What absolutely sort of jumps off the screen in terms of this word cloud is the word resilience. And so absolutely, research shows that after a really difficult, challenging thing happens, that a lot of folks emerge with better skills to cope with challenging things, with these difficult things. We can also see collaboration, communication, some idea of perspective shifting. So kind of changing the way that we look at things, which is very, very common in terms of outcomes after a disaster. Empathy skills, telehealth, we love seeing that, family. Absolutely. So kind of the positive reframe of many of us, having to stay at home so much has been a greater appreciation of, and even an evolution of our personal relationships in terms of family partnerships and things like that. So thank you for sharing that, Christy. I think we can probably go back to the presentation now, but I appreciate you all participating in that in terms of thinking through what can be the positive outcomes that can emerge from this kind of disaster. And again, as we think about really the value of some of the early interventions that Joe and Erin are going to share with us. That's what we're going for, right? Something bad happens that we can't control, and we want to know what we can do to try to increase the likelihood that some of these positive outcomes will emerge. As we're talking about trauma and as we're talking about disasters and COVID, just wanted to invite you all to check out these resources here in terms of our own self-care. Again, we have all experienced negative impacts from COVID and the other challenges of the last year, and taking care of ourselves is really important. This Pause, Reset, Nourish framework comes out of Hamilton Health Sciences up in Canada, and Christy's sharing the links there in the Zoom. And there are a number of these kinds of self-care frameworks. This is just one that I came across last week. But one thing I really like, if you go to the actual Hamilton Health Science website, there's a lot of tools there that are very much, you can open it and print it off and use it right away. I share one here, this start of the day resilience checklist. So again, this is for the grownups in a community or an organization. I actually have this on the wall of my office since that is my workspace right now. But just a good start of the day resilience checklist. And there's another one that's an end of the day checklist. What we know about self-care and developing resilience and developing these kinds of coping strategies is that the real magic is that there is no magic, but it just takes practice. These are the kinds of things that we need to do and do again and again every day so that we can build up those muscles. So just wanted to share these with you here. So if we can go to the next slide, Christy. So trauma. So there are a lot of different definitions of trauma. We really like the SAMHSA definition. It's easy to remember. So this idea that these 3 E's of trauma. So individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced, that's the second E, as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects, there's the third E, on functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so these 3 E's, there's an event, it's experienced, and it has these effects. So it's easy to remember, but also I think conveys the complexity around trauma. Trauma is something that our brains really struggle to understand because a lot of times trauma response doesn't make sense. Our brains want to look at something and say, well, this is big trauma, or this is little trauma, this is bad trauma, or this is not so bad trauma. And that's just not the way it works. And the reason for that is in this definition, right? That it's around how an individual experiences it. So we're not going to delve a lot into the complexity around sort of all the facets of trauma here, but it is worth talking about because trauma is being discussed so often. One of the silver linings from my perspective about and around the COVID pandemic is that we are having a lot more conversation about trauma, about mental health, and that's a real opportunity. Trauma and mental health were an issue before COVID. They will continue to be an issue, but a lot of people are talking about this now. That means that we start to use language in a way that may or may not make sense. So when we think about trauma, also we want to think about sort of public trauma or shared trauma, community trauma. And so these are the kinds of traumas that we typically associate with natural disasters. These are things that people can see, that lots of people can see, and that affect lots of people. And the distinction here being this kind of public shared community trauma versus perhaps an individual or a private trauma. So something that is personal, maybe something only I know about or myself and another couple people know. And the research shows that those things are experienced differently. We are going to focus here today on this idea of response to a natural disaster. So this idea of a community, a shared, a public trauma, and therefore are thinking not just about individual response, but also organizational community responses and certainly families. If we can go to the next slide, Christy. But we also want to acknowledge with COVID and with any kind of natural disasters, these kind of public or shared kinds of events that happen, that we are all experiencing something. And so in some ways we are all kind of in the same storm, but we're not experiencing the same things, right? And so this is kind of the challenge of trying to understand this sort of public or shared trauma, is that yes, maybe we've all been through something that is similar. We're in the same storm, but we all have different kinds of boats, right? And this is really acknowledging that all of us bring our own backpack of stuff to the table when these kinds of things happen. And certainly some of us are in this storm on a yacht, and some of us are hanging on to, the door. And just trying to stay afloat. And so it is important for us to consider the complexity here, even as we talk about something that might be a shared experience. So with that, I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Joa to talk a little bit more about early intervention after trauma.
All right, thank you, Melissa, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We really appreciate you joining us here today, and look forward to starting some conversations today that I hope will continue with many of us even after this webinar is over, as we think about transitioning in the next few months to offering more in-depth trainings on some of the models that we're going to talk about here today, so that each of you can think about how to integrate some of the skills that we're considering today for trauma-exposed youth and families in your own work. I'm reminded at this point, as we think about just how trauma can in some ways lead to meaningful growth and change in each of our lives, that we have to also consider the ways in which that growth occurs and why that growth occurs. And so I'm thinking right now about something that Viktor Frankl once said, and for those of you who are psychology majors, that name might sound familiar, and some of you might be familiar with Frankl's work anyway, but Dr. Frankl once made an interesting observation, informed by his own experiences, that meaning and how we derive meaning from the difficult things in our lives really comes from how we think about making sense out of the intense suffering that each of us sometimes go through. And that's especially true when we think about trauma. So at this point, I think since we've thought about trauma and grief, or we've thought about, trauma and growth, I talk about grief a lot because I also specialize in grief and loss in some of my work, but so that was a little interference there. But in thinking about trauma and growth, let's also think about some of the unique challenges that come up in response to trauma that can create the circumstances for each of us to begin making meaning out of what we've gone through. So in the same way that we did a word cloud activity a few minutes ago, thinking about ways that growth can occur following trauma, let's also be mindful of some of the unique short-term challenges facing youth and families after disasters and trauma. So at this point, we'll do another word cloud activity, and I'd like each of you to just think about, based on either your own work with youth and families or whether, your own experiences, what are some of the different short-term challenges that we face in the aftermath of a trauma? So let's take a few minutes and let's see what comes up and what kind of things stand out to folks. Housing, yeah. Social supports, money, absolutely. Resources, yes. Exhaustion, I saw that pop up in the chat, absolutely. And it seems like, yeah, so resources, housing, security, yes. Yes, certainly so. And security in a lot of different ways, right? Because depending on the kind of trauma that we're talking about, we may lack security in the sense that we have a stable place to stay related to housing, which is what other folks have mentioned. If the trauma involved violence or community violence or interpersonal violence, there may be concerns about security related to perpetrators, right, still being at large, or if there's ongoing threat from others that committed a trauma or an atrocity, that certainly is a concern. So yeah, mental health. Now I see several folks here mentioning fear, depression, right? So absolutely, yes, that emotional distress that we think of as those big challenges that folks face. Related to that, guilt. I just saw guilt pop up. So absolutely, yeah. I'm having emotional breakdowns, right? So food, paycheck, someone mentioned that. So that certainly can be a big piece. So stability, yeah. No, I think these are all absolutely spot on, and folks are really, and loss. Someone here even mentioned loss, right? So when we think about loss of a lot of the resources that folks are talking about here, right? Loss of occupational stability to support you and your family. If I've now been uprooted and I have to change schools, right? Loss of my friend network, if we're talking about children and youth. So yeah, certainly so. Isolation, yeah, these are all spot on. Academic deficits, so someone else noted that, and I'm just sort of looking through some of these things here. So, so yeah, depression and yeah, technology, right? Someone mentioned Wi-Fi, right? When we think about the resources that we can use, certainly loss of access to resources that connect us all together in an increasingly technological world is certainly something that we see disrupted by trauma fairly often. And confusion, right? And I think that maybe really brings all the different pieces together that folks are sort of acknowledging and bringing up right here, that really, and a lot of us can probably speak to this through our own personal experience. And the immediate aftermath of a trauma or a significant stressor, things just don't always make sense. Things are confusing and we don't always know what to do next, right? Or where to turn and who to turn to. So one of the things that really stands out to me in thinking about what I'm seeing here, and thank you all so much for sharing some of these unique thoughts, is that it's really pointing to something important that I think we know from research, from clinical experience about trauma, and that each of you can probably attest to in the work that you've done along the way with working with kids and youth and in your own lives, right? That trauma affects a variety of different pieces of our lives in a lot of different ways, right? There are a lot of different areas that trauma can adversely affect our lives, from thinking about our emotional well-being to just having our basic needs met, to our social supports, to how we relate to other people. So a lot of different ways that trauma affects our lives. And that's especially true in the immediate aftermath of trauma. So let's think then about what we can do with that, and then how that shapes our discussion for what we mean by early intervention, right? Because early intervention here, we're really talking about behavioral and psychological kinds of interventions that we can do in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, right? And this differs a little bit from what we would do if we're thinking about providing mental health treatment, right? Or psychological treatment for trauma-related mental health problems, okay? So it's a little bit different, right? But I think early intervention fills an important space in the continuum of mental health care for trauma survivors, right? And then when we think about early intervention, the goal is not to go in and try to treat trauma-related mental health problems like post-traumatic stress disorder or major depression, or even prolonged or complicated grief or other kinds of things that may come up. That's not really what we're trying to do. But we do hope that we can get in and try to help create conditions where folks can naturally recover before they go on to develop those kinds of chronic mental health problems, right? So how do we do that? And what do we try to do with early intervention? Well, really, we're trying to just reduce immediate distress. So several folks in the last word cloud activity talked about depression, fear, feeling overwhelmed, confused, right? One goal that we have for early intervention is just to try to help, again, alleviate some of that distress in whatever form it might be occurring for folks, and try to help create some conditions of safety and comfort, which Erin will talk about here in the next few minutes, right? But beyond that, what about all those other things that trauma affects in our lives, all those other challenges, right? Well, in addition to trying to reduce immediate distress, another big thing that we want to try to do with early intervention is mitigate risk factors for chronic psychological problems, okay? So resource loss. When we think about all the different types of resources that folks mentioned in the last activity that can be affected by trauma, right? From financial security to being able to regularly attend school, to access to technology and information that links you to your broader community, your friend networks, your school networks, your work networks, right? Resources can be extremely negatively impacted by trauma and in the wake of trauma. So we want to try to think about how to link kids and families and adults who've been exposed to trauma to resources where they can begin to reestablish those kinds of connections. We want to try to address isolation and withdrawal, right? Because we know that social support is a big, big protective factor and helps protect against long-term psychological complications from trauma exposure. We want to try to help address emotional distress and negative cognitions. So what do we mean by negative cognitions? Things like maybe feeling like you feel guilty for having not done more to prevent the trauma, or wish that you had responded in a different way. Or you might blame yourself for something that really might not have been your fault, but we have those kinds of thoughts about our own perceived role in what happened, right? So with early intervention, the first thing that we really want to do is get a sense of all these different risk factors for chronic psychological problems, see which of these areas have been most directly affected for each person, right? Because trauma will affect all of these areas in different ways for each of us. So we want to see which of these sort of risk factors are most relevant for the child or the family that we're working with, And then depending on which risk factors are most present and most important, think about addressing those and again, create conditions where long-term growth and recovery can naturally begin to occur. And the important thing is that the kinds of interventions that we're going to talk about here are things that each and every one of us on this webinar can do today, right? You don't have to be a mental health professional to do this stuff, and that's really the beauty in it. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just kind of show you how the things we're going to present today fit into the continuum of care for trauma survivors. And this just kind of shows you, all the different kinds of things that, at least as a psychologist, right, for folks with mental health backgrounds, we might think of as kind of the types of treatments or interventions that we would do for folks. And really, we kind of think about the things that we're going to tell you about today as being examples of primary and secondary prevention efforts, okay? So with primary prevention, what we're talking about are acute kinds of interventions available to all trauma-exposed youth and families. These are going to be interventions that are kind of universal, so anyone who's gone through a trauma would likely benefit from these kinds of interventions. They're generally offered pretty soon, right? The first 2 or 3 days or first 24 hours after a trauma happens. So these are quick, they're done fast, they're done on the ground, and they're available to like everyone, and we think that they're likely, based on the best available evidence, going to be useful for most folks, right? So Erin's going to talk a little bit about an example of a primary prevention method called psychological first aid. And then I'll tell you about a secondary prevention effort called Skills for Psychological Recovery, which kind of builds on psychological first aid, but is a little bit more intense, a little more targeted, and tends to be more appropriate for folks kind of in the weeks and maybe months that follow after a trauma happens. So when folks continue to have some ongoing concerns in the different areas that we talked about, then something like Skills for Psychological Recovery might be more appropriate. And then, of course, we have more targeted kinds of treatments, so psychological treatments that you might get in a behavioral health clinic. And those are more tertiary kinds of prevention efforts, but we won't really focus as much on those today, as much as what kind of things we can do in the days and weeks that follow and the role that each of us can have. So with that, I'll turn it over to Erin, and I'll let Erin talk to you a little bit now about a primary prevention method that we often find really important, psychological first aid. So Erin, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Joa. And thanks again, everyone, for being here. I feel like my time is so limited due to COVID, and I just very much appreciate all of the interest in this topic, and hope that we can continue to work together and be resources for our geographic region. So I'm going to talk a little bit about psychological first aid. As everyone on my team knows, I get really excited about psychological first aid, so it's hard to just give you a little piece of it. But hopefully the pieces that I provide today can both be immediately useful and can also help you all begin to think, within my school, within my private practice, within my agency, who are some key stakeholders that really would be good to have trained in this approach, or perhaps in Skills for Psychological Recovery, or both, at a higher and deeper level. Who are the individuals who, when something bad happens in our community, would tend to have FaceTime with people in the early aftermath? And how can we think about scaling up our local area to be able to respond? Because as we've talked already, psychological first aid was developed to be delivered in the immediate aftermath, the hours, days, and first couple of weeks after someone has experienced a trauma. Now, psychological first aid was kind of specifically designed for the disaster trauma context. And I'm going to go ahead and pop up a link that takes you to the page on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that will get you to all the relevant links about PFA and SPR, what languages they're in, what handouts, where's the manual, where are the free online trainings in these approaches, because those exist, and that's really exciting. And if you look through those pages, what you'll see is that the focus really is on disaster trauma, kind of these shared events that typically people within a certain geographic region will experience kind of at the same time. But there are lots of other applications for these principles. So if someone at the individual level has just experienced a trauma, these principles are extremely applicable to those types of situations as well. psychological first aid is truly meant to be provided by any response worker. Being a mental health trained person, having a mental health background really doesn't help you. It doesn't make you better at this. And as a psychologist, I feel like it's kind of okay for me to say in some ways it can be harder for people with intense mental health training and kind of these treatments for depression, for post-traumatic stress disorder, to really step back and say, that's not what I'm doing right now. Right now, I am interacting with someone who's just experienced something that may have taken their sense of control away from them, and that probably almost certainly raised their stress response, their physiological stress response. I'm interacting with someone whose, biology is kind of priming them to be looking out for threat, to be on alert, and whose problem solving might look a little different. They might be a lot more focused on the short term than the long term. And how do I interact with this person in a way that will help decrease that stress response in the immediate sense, so that we can begin putting them on a path toward resilience or recovery and all that stuff that we saw in our first word cloud. So again, be thinking about who in our community interacts with people in the immediate aftermath. Who's interacting with kids who might be being relocated to a different home? Who sees kids at school after there's been a flood or a tornado? Who is talking to families when they call the school and say, somebody in our family has COVID? Who are those individuals that you might want to think about getting trained? I also really like psychological first aid because it's meant to be flexibly applied. There is no one way to apply psychological first aid. There are core principles that you get trained in that, depending on someone's age, depending on how long it's been since the trauma happened, and depending on their cultural background, you can flexibly apply these principles. There's a PFA manual, but there's also a manual for schools, and there's a manual specific to spiritual leaders. So the idea here is that we are not trying to impose particular ways of coping onto people, but we are trying to help people connect with ways of coping that have helped them in the past and that we hope can continue to help them in the future. And so making sure that interventions are culturally relevant and congruent is of high importance. Another kind of broad thing about psychological first aid that I want to make sure that I mention is that it is really meant to promote efficacy at its core, both at the individual and at the community level. So psychological first aid is not best delivered by someone from out of town. First of all, we get there too late. Second of all, people who aren't familiar with your community aren't going to be great at connecting disaster affected persons to relevant resources within the community. They aren't going to be great at knowing, hey, here are the things that have in the past helped us as a community. And also there's something very healing about people who have been through something hard also being the ones to affect the positive change, getting the control back a little bit, saying this bad thing happened, but it didn't change everything about me. I still have lots of strengths and I have the ability to get myself back on a path to recovery or to stay in my current level of functioning. And I want to say two kind of definitional things here about psychological first aid before I give you a sense of the 8 core actions that comprise it. One is that it does differ from mental health first aid. And we know as a team that there are lots of people and organizations in our geographic area that receive training in mental health first aid. But again, psychological first aid really focused on that immediate aftermath. And it also differs from critical incidents response debriefing. And I would say that perhaps the most poignant or clear way that it differs from that approach is that within the psychological first aid framework, there isn't any recommendation for people gathering in groups to discuss what has just occurred. It's kind of perhaps the key difference there. All right, next slide, please. So here is an overview of the 8 core actions that comprise psychological first aid. I've said this before, but you don't have to deliver all 8 of them. You could deliver 1. And you don't have to go in order. So you could deliver the first one and that's all, but you could also deliver number 8 and that's all. So once you really get trained in the approach, part of the task is figuring out, what does this person who's right in front of me need right now? I do think that the first 3 core actions are, not to use the word core a whole lot, but kind of core to the approach, in the sense that probably anyone you encounter, you're going to want to make contact with and engage in a way that will help them trust you, and that will make them feel comfortable. And so when you get into learning more about this approach, you'll talk about ways to make contact and engagement that are um, likely to resonate with someone who's just been disaster affected. So as a psychologist, if I were acting as a psychological first aid provider, I probably wouldn't approach a disaster affected person and say, "Hi, I'm Dr. Hambrick. I'm a psychologist. Can I help you with anything?" Right? Because who knows what that might make somebody think? Why have they identified me as someone that's in need of a psychologist? A doctor. I don't need a doctor right now. I need to charge my cell phone. I need to have some water. I haven't even been able to call my daughter yet because things have been so hectic. And so really thinking about, how do we introduce ourselves and tell people what they need to know, and also what will help bring that stress level down. So, "Hi, I'm Erin. This is my role." Let's say that you've got people gathered at a shelter because they've been displaced due to a flood. "This is my role. Is there anything you need right now? Here's some food, here's some water, here's a cell phone charging station," right? Really the basics. But what I like about psychological first aid is it seems so basic, but yet sometimes it's nice to know that those basic things actually have been shown in the literature to promote long-term recovery, that focusing on that can really help a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, where I'm going to talk a little more in depth about the safety and comfort core action. And then I'll spend a minute talking about promoting connections and connections with social supports, because I think those really go together. So we know from the literature on psychology, where we kind of study people over time, who tends to do better following disaster trauma. What we find is that the shorter amount of time someone's physiological stress response system stays in high drive, the better a person is likely to do. And so it is so very important to instill a sense of safety and comfort as soon as possible. How can you do that? Well, part of how you can do that is the way that you make contact with someone. If you're making contact with a child, maybe think about sitting on a chair, or instead of asking them to say a lot of things, just kind of offering some crayons, right? Really thinking, how can I send a message that this is a place of safety? We think about media exposure a lot when we think about promoting a sense of safety and comfort. It can be really normative right after something has happened to want a lot of information. Say there's been a lot of storms come through the area. It's normal for people to want to be looking on their phone and saying, is there going to be another storm cell, and scrolling and continuing to look. And so it can be helpful, especially if you have groups of disaster affected people together, to say, hey, here's a mechanism that we're going to use to let people know any important weather related information. But we're not going to have TVs going with national news constantly, and we're not going to let news people in to try to interview you right in this moment that something bad has just happened. So how do we reduce media exposure? And that's even been, I think, a helpful way to reduce stress given the COVID pandemic. Is a lot of families have said, well, this pandemic is ongoing. What can I do to make my child or adolescent or kids at school feel more safe? And I think about having a specific time of day that you check media, a specific source that you're going to check for a specific thing that can give you information about how to stay safe, but that then you disengage from once you have that information. Okay, so I kind of know the COVID levels are low, medium, or high today. That's going to direct my behavior in this way. And now I'm going to go ahead and back away. We also want to think about helping increase structure. and routine. So lots of times we'll say, oh, something bad just happened to this student. We don't want to re-engage them in school too quickly, but we also don't want to wait too long, because that structure and that familiarity can be really, really, really soothing to the stress response system. And Chrissy, if you can go on to the next slide, it can also help them reestablish with social supports that have been helpful to them in the past. So another way I think that we can continue to promote that sense of safety and comfort is to really focus on relationships. And this doesn't mean have somebody come up and say, tell me what happened to you. This doesn't even mean talking, but this means presence. This means being there in parallel with somebody, making sure kids have opportunities to socialize. Our kids might need that more right now than they need learning. I know we're all worried that they've missed out so much on learning, but they might have trouble learning if they don't have these opportunities for reestablishing their calming and soothing socialization patterns. And really modeling that for children and families as well, showing them the way that we rely on our social supports, so that we can recover and soothe our own stress response systems. Because sometimes when you're providing early interventions, you happen to also be somebody who was affected. So that's a lot of information really fast, but we do need to move on. So if we can move on to the poll next. So we asked you this question before the webinar, but now that we've kind of explained what psychological first aid is, how it differs from some other available models, if you would just answer the question that's going to pop up on your screen of, prior to this webinar, how familiar were you with psychological first aid, from not at all to extremely? I don't know, Robert, when I'm supposed to see the results, but.
Sure, I will end it when it looks like we have a pretty good representation. Right now we're right at about 50 people, so give it just a
Awesome.
maybe 15
Thanks,
or 20 more
everybody.
seconds.
So engaged.
I'll give it just a couple more seconds.
And again, this poll is to give us a sense for kind of where you all are in terms of your familiarity and where we all might think about going with future learning. So it looks like about 23% not at all, 34% slightly, but some of you extremely and very familiar, and glad to have you all join as well as kind of local representation, representatives of this knowledge. All right, thanks. I'm going to turn it over back to Joa, who's going to talk to us about skills for psychological recovery.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Erin. And one thing that I'll just sort of highlight here, and I know Erin can speak to, and for those of you who come or participate in the trainings that we'll do on psychological first aid here coming up soon, later on in the spring, we'll talk a bit more about this. But one of the things that I think is also important to note and really I think really nice about psychological first aid and both skills for psychological recovery is that both of these models can be used using telehealth technologies, telehealth-based platforms, even though I think psychological first aid, ideally we really like to be on site when we're doing it. I can point to examples of where we used this in the early part of the pandemic in hospitals when we actually weren't even allowed to go into patient rooms, right? But we could at least call in. We could, mention their name from outside the room so they could hear us, and then tell them that we were going to call in, right? And we could actually talk to folks that way. And we could do some of these things, and it still is very meaningful and helps create those conditions of safety and comfort to folks, right? So I think it's important to note that, these are really flexible. They can be applied in very flexible ways. And so, I think we all just have to be creative in thinking about how to do that. But again, one of the things that we want to do early on with psychological first aid is create conditions for safety and comfort and do a lot of the things that Erin mentioned there. And sometimes that's going to be enough that folks can kind of begin to, feel a little bit more grounded and can begin to move on and sort of naturally start to utilize the assets in our immediate environments and begin to sort of naturally recover, right? Without any kind of formal intervention from folks, from folks like us who are out there sort of professionally doing some of this work. But for some folks, that certainly isn't going to be the case. Other folks are going to continue encountering a number of different challenges related to resource loss, or may still find that they're really isolated in certain ways, right? Or you may have a lot of those other sort of risk factors that we talked about, including elevated emotional distress that just doesn't seem to quite resolve over time. And for those folks, something a little more intensive, like a secondary prevention effort, like Skills for Psychological Recovery, is often going to be a really, really helpful approach to take. Now, I like to emphasize when I'm doing trainings on this model in particular with Skills for Psychological Recovery, and when I'm doing this with trauma-exposed youth and families and adults in the community, I'll mention to folks, and I like to clarify, we're not talking about mental health treatment here, right? Here I'm not here to treat anything necessarily at this point, right? But let's think about just how the kinds of cognitive, behavioral, and psychological skills that we know are helpful for trauma survivors may be helpful for folks continuing to experience some ongoing distress related to the trauma or the disaster that they've been through, right? Again, with the goal of, hoping that if we can give folks some additional skills and supports to help address those risk factors that we talked about, then we can begin to slowly help folks learn how to manage those risk factors, manage those kinds of stressors that they're continuing to experience, and again, promote natural recovery. So with Skills for Psychological Recovery, this is an evidence-informed intervention, much like psychological first aid. And like psychological first aid was developed by the National Center for PTSD and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So these are both early interventions developed by both of these big organizations. And with Skills for Psychological Recovery, the goal is much like what we would do with psychological first aid. We really want to just identify whatever a child or family's unique needs are. So try to figure out what concerns are most pressing for them, what ways their life has been most directly affected by the trauma, and then try to teach some specific cognitive and behavioral kinds of skills to help folks address the needs that are most relevant for them, okay? So one of the things that I like then about that is, like psychological first aid, this is a flexible sort of modular approach. We don't sit down and, say, here are the steps that you need to take and, say that it's going to be true for everyone, because that's not always the case, right? We see what's most relevant for you, and then we make some specific kinds of recommendations about strategies that we think will be helpful based on what you're telling us is most important for you. So, and a little bit of a difference too, I think, in terms of what separates this from psychological first aid, is that this, again, is typically a little more kind of involved and a little more intensive. So Skills for Psychological Recovery as a model tends to be delivered in like 3 to 5 sessions, right? So we try to have like 3 to 5 contacts. And that's based on evidence that suggests it generally takes about 3 to 5 sessions to really help folks kind of acquire some of the skills that we're teaching them. Whereas psychological first aid is typically done in 1 to 2 contacts, right? So this is a little bit longer, a little bit more involved, but sort of involves the same basic ideas as what we do with PFA and psychological first aid. So one of the very first things that we would do in Skills for Psychological Recovery, much like we would do in psychological first aid, is try to just meet with folks and gather information about what their most pressing concerns are across all those domains that you all talked about when we did the last word bubble activity, right? I want to know what physical health concerns you have. Do you have any concerns about being able to get to and from doctor's appointments, pay for your medications, right? How do you have any concerns about that, or for anyone else in your family? Do you have concerns about your emotional well-being or the emotional well-being of other people in your family, right? So knowing, we want to know where folks are with the fear, the sadness, the guilt, the confusion, all those things that we talked about before. What are your concerns related to safety, right? Do you have concerns about just having a safe place to stay? And, what are those concerns like for you? And what can we think about doing to help link you to the places you need to help make sure that you and your family are safe? We want to know about sort of basic necessities. Are you able to, get groceries? pay your bills? Are you able to get to and from school, right? So those are things that we want to know for folks. We'll also talk a little bit with folks about how are you doing at school, right? Or if we're talking to parents, how are you doing at work? And, how are you getting along with other people? And how are you doing with your friends and other people in your family, right? So we ask about a lot of different areas where folks' lives may have been negatively affected by the trauma, just to get sort of an overall sense of where folks are. And again, from there, kind of think about what's something that we can do together. And if we could use this time to help change one of these things, what would it be, right? Knowing that if we can target some of those specific stressors, folks are more likely to naturally recover long-term without more intensive treatment being needed, right? So again, this is I think a great model. For folks who are interested, you can find the information gathering form and additional information about some of the modules at this link that's provided right here on the slide for you. And this is the link to the National Center for PTSD's website, where you can download this manual for free. And again, I think that's one of the nice things about these models and these manuals. All the materials are out there and they're free for you, so that we can encourage wide dissemination. But once we know sort of what concerns are most pressing for kids and families, and we know sort of what issues are most relevant for them, the next thing we do is, in Skills for Psychological Recovery, is kind of select what skills we want to try to teach people to address the issues that are most relevant for them. So let's talk just briefly about the 5 core skills in Skills for Psychological Recovery that we often teach people. And this will just give you a quick overview of the kinds of things that we do. And when we offer a training on this later in the spring, for folks who are interested, we'll go into a lot more detail about sort of the nuances of how to do all this. But one of the first skills that we will teach people, again, depending on what their concerns are problem-solving skills, right? How do you break things down into specific steps, brainstorm a lot of different solutions for solving the problem, and then think about ways to implement a strategy that's likely to be most effective. Now, that all sounds kind of like, a basic skill in some ways, and in many ways it is, but it's a skill that is often overshadowed by the confusion and complexity that we experience in the aftermath of trauma, right? So in working with families, I've been told very often how much they appreciate just thinking about how to break some things that they're going through down into different steps that they can tackle piece by piece, bit by bit, so that it doesn't all feel quite so overwhelming. So problem-solving skills are a big part of what we do in Skills for Psychological Recovery. I'm going to go counterclockwise here because I want to end with positive activity scheduling and maybe tell you a little bit about how you can use that in your own practice even after today. But another piece of what we'll do with this is building social connections. So again, we know that social support is a very big protective factor when it comes to long-term recovery after trauma and disasters. So we want to know, especially for folks who are socially isolated in key ways, who can we help connect you to in your community? Someone that can give you emotional support, good information about resources when you need it, and even some additional kinds of tangible instrumental supports if there's something that you or your family need and just don't know how else to get, right? So building good social connections can be really important. We'll do some sort of helpful thinking kinds of activities. And we say helpful thinking, right? Because again, we don't want to go back necessarily and try to, change or, reframe how people are thinking about the things that they're going through, right? But we do sometimes work with folks to step back and think about their experiences from a broad range of different perspectives so that we can work with folks who might be experiencing guilt, blame, or other kinds of negative trauma-related cognitions that are really starting to have an impact on their lives and the lives of the folks around them, right, and their families. So helpful thinking can sometimes be an important skill that we'll teach folks. With managing reactions, what we're doing here is often giving people information about what common trauma-related symptoms and reactions look like. So we'll give folks information about post-traumatic stress symptoms, depression symptoms, grief symptoms, things that might occur in terms of anger, sleep disruption, things that are pretty common for most of us when we go through a trauma, right, or survive a trauma or a disaster. But then after giving folks information, we'll try to just work with them to think about, if you experience these reactions, what are some things that you can personally do to help manage those reactions when they occur, right? So can you anticipate when they're likely going to be cued by something, when they're going to occur? And then what things can you do to help manage those kinds of things, right? So that can be simple kinds of things, like even just, calm breathing kinds of exercises. Or if you have like a little, talisman or rock, or, like a bracelet or something that you can hold to, just touch to remind yourself, for example, that these reactions generally are cued, they peak, and then they slow down and they kind of go away, right? But something that you can do just to help calm yourself. So we teach folks ways to manage trauma kinds of reactions. But one of the other skills that we use, and one that I think is a particularly helpful and valuable skill, is positive activity scheduling. And this is one that I think is great because it resonates with kids, it resonates with families, it resonates with adults, right? It's exactly what it sounds like. We sit down and we try to think about what are things that are important and meaningful to you that maybe you haven't done so much of in the last few weeks that you'd really like to get back to, that if you could start doing those things again, would probably really start to, affect how you feel and kind of, affect your mood and maybe, help uplift you a little bit, right? So we sit with folks and try to think about identifying things that you would likely enjoy doing that are meaningful to you. And I think it's important when we do any of these skills to kind of give folks a rationale for why we're asking them to do it. But this is one that we can kind of easily explain to folks, right? Developmentally, we can kind of explain this to a whole range of folks in a way that they get it, right? That, if you think about how trauma kinds of just fills us up with really difficult emotions and, really kind of like painful feelings and hard feelings to experience, doing things that are important and meaningful to us and that are fun is more likely to fill us up with those kind of positive, happy emotions, right? Those things that we want more of right now in our lives, right? So we'll sit down in the manual. For those of you who access the manual, you can go on to the manual and see some specific tips in there that kind of give you some ideas for things you can do for kids. So there are lots of things you can do in there and look for some ideas. But let me challenge all of you, if you're working with youth and families right now that are struggling to manage some of the difficulties related to the pandemic or other kinds of trauma or traumatic events in their lives, see if you can sit down with folks and maybe think about, what is something that would be personally affirming to you, right? That you could try doing this week. And usually with Skills for Psychological Recovery, we'll suggest scheduling 2 activities the first week that you try this. One that you can do alone, and then one that you do with someone else, right? So if you're a child, with a sibling or with your parents or all of the above, if you want, right? If you're an adult, right, think about something you can do by yourself or something that you can do with other people, whoever that might be, but something that would be fun and meaningful. And let me ask you all, why do you think we ask folks to do those 2 activities? One solo activity and one social fun activity. There's an important reason I think we ask folks to do this, and to do both in particular. Any ideas? Chime in on chat. I'll keep an eye out and see if anything pops up here. Let me ask you this. Why do you think it's especially important to do the social activity? Yeah, community and support building. Yeah, so I see that, Anthony, thank you for chiming in on that. I think that's an important piece of this, right? That when we start doing activities that have been really interrupted by something as severe as trauma, the social activities sometimes help give us that nudge to get back into the rhythm of doing things that we might not always get sometimes if it's harder to get started if we're doing something alone, right? So I think the social piece kind of helps make it more likely sometimes that we'll actually get started and get back on track doing those things that really are important to our long-term recovery. So we'll talk more about this, how to implement this, and some unique nuances of how to do some of this the next time we get together, hopefully some of us, and talk more about training around skills for psychological recovery. But I hope that we'll again see many of you for future trainings on psychological first aid and skills for psychological recovery later this spring. And I appreciate all of you joining us today and hope that this has been helpful for each of you in thinking about how we can all help support each other in the days, weeks, and years ahead. So thank you so much, everyone. I'll turn it back over to the rest of the team to wrap us up.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. I wanted to let you know that you'll be receiving afterwards a link to the video of the recording along with a PowerPoint and all the resources that have been discussed today. And hopefully you'll go out and finish the survey and complete the survey and let us know how to better approach more training with these areas, as well as what will be most useful for you as we look at providing other opportunities related to this approach to disasters and ongoing trauma that results. So hope everyone has a great week, and we will hopefully talk to all of you again very soon. Have a good day.